So, welcome to a very special edition of the Data Exchange podcast with my good friends Jenn Webb and Paco Nathan. So, today we're going to talk about two topics. The first is Ray and the Ray Summit, because Paco and I are involved with that conference, and it's coming up at the end of September. And then also, since Paco was my very first guest on this podcast when I started it, and we're now past 30 episodes, past 6 months, I thought we'd do a mini retrospective. And for this episode, I brought in the professionals, the professional interviewers. And that would be Jenn Webb, who is a seasoned journalist, former editor of the O'Reilly Radar. So, Jenn Webb, take it away.
All right. Well, before we get started on the podcast highlights, let's first talk about the Ray Summit that's coming up September 30th to October 1st. And to get our listeners up to speed, Ben, you've described Ray as a framework for building frameworks. Can you talk a bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, so Ray, it turns out, is emerging to be kind of the go-to distributed computation platform. And that's important for a few reasons. The first is machine learning is becoming important, and specifically deep learning is becoming more widely used. And it turns out that for some of these leading edge deep learning models, you really need to scale out a cluster of computers. And and the other factor there is Python has emerged as the de facto programming language for machine learning and deep learning. And so in both of those cases, Ray turns out to be the easiest way to, one, scale out to a cluster, but also to do it within Python. And Ray has the additional advantage that it's actually written in C++, so it's pretty fast even on a single computer. So what's happened since the release of Ray is that one, people have used it to scale out their Python workloads, so their normal, the things that they were already doing in Python. So I know several people, for example, who are doing online learning or optical character recognition. They were having a hard time doing it quickly on a single machine, so they were able to scale out very quickly using Ray. And then the other thing is that Ray also comes with a set of libraries that are useful for machine learning and a lot of other tasks related to Python in particular. And so you can actually be using Ray without actually knowing you're using Ray, because you might be using one of these libraries. And then finally, one of the recent trends is that writers of popular libraries like Spacey and Hugging Face in the NLP world are starting to use Ray as well. So Ray is really, as you mentioned, Jen, a framework for writing frameworks. So you can use Ray to write libraries, or if you have an existing library, you can take advantage of Ray. Because I know, for example, Paco has been working with Anyscale on their tutorials and learning materials. So he's actually kind of immersed himself deeply in some of these libraries.
So are the libraries the differentiating factor that separates them from the other end-to-end machine learning platforms?
I think that so Ray itself is not a machine learning platform, but you could use it to write a machine learning platform, or you could use the libraries as part of your machine learning platform. So which you actually raised a good point, which is these libraries don't force you into using Ray entirely. So you can pick and choose which of these libraries you use. So for example, if you need a library for model serving, but you already have a library for training, then you can use RayServe, but use your existing library for training. So it's not monolithic, which is another reason why people like it.
Yeah, very much so. It's so great to be able to bring in the entire richness out of Python. Just look through, and whatever you need, there's probably a few different implementations of it in Python. And the thing about Ray is that you can leverage a lot of this existing work, whether you're working in say simulations. I don't know, you're doing something with pulp, or you're working in an area of deep learning, and you're going to use PyTorch, or on and on. Serving models through some sort of API, and you've previously been working, say, with Flask. Ray has the means of implementing different means of different methods of parallelism that are really simple to add in Python code, and can allow you to integrate a lot of existing code, as opposed to having a framework that has to rebuild the entire world from scratch. Because I've lived through a few different generations of big data tooling, and that was always the thing, is like, somebody'd make some advances, it would get popular, and then we'd realize, oh, we have to have a good way to do XYZ machine learning in Hadoop. And so now there's all these things being put into frameworks. Ray is the opposite. It's like, no, there's a lot of other frameworks and libraries out there. Keep using them. We're just going to make them better and faster and work more together.
So who are the typical users of Ray, and do you have any favorite use cases? Is there anything fun?
So I think so. There are the individual developers who are, like I said already, familiar with several Python libraries, but they are in need of scaling it. So for example, Ray will let you scale things like scikit-learn. And even more recently, they have a library that integrates their hyperparameter tuning right into scikit-learn. And then there's, as I mentioned earlier, there's the library makers that are beginning to use Ray. So let's take the most popular library in NLP, Spacy. So pretty soon you'll be using Spacy, but under the hood, it's using Ray, but you're still using Spacy, which you've come to love and appreciate. So as far as use cases, so there's many. So for example, in the conference, we have a cluster of talks from financial services companies. So these are big companies that are beginning to use Ray. So JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Two Sigma, and Morgan Stanley. So they use it for a variety of use cases. So time series being one, reinforcement learning being another. There are also companies that are using Ray as part of their larger machine learning platform. We have lots of talks like that at the Ray Summit. Ant Financial, which is the largest, one of the largest financial services companies in China, relies heavily on Ray, actually. So for actual production, consumer-facing services for online learning and real-time recommendations. But there are other companies, so LinkedIn, there's a German company called InstaDeep that uses Ray a lot for reinforcement learning. And then, as I mentioned, the most popular natural language processing libraries are coalescing and starting to use Ray. So this includes Spacy, Hugging Face, and Spark NLP. And then for reinforcement learning, we're seeing a variety of applications around two main buckets. One is personalization and recommendations, and then the second one is simulations. So we'll have several talks at the conference around these topics. But Paco also has been playing around with the reinforcement learning library that comes with Ray. So, and he's been periodically sending me messages about things that he's discovering.
Yeah, no, it's been great. The tutorials at Ray Summit, we're going to have a half day really focusing more on general use of Ray for parallelism and some of the patterns that are involved there, such as using task parallel or using actor pattern. And really, how can you go in and take, like, for instance, I had a client that had a large use case of parsing millions of PDF documents. And by adding 4 lines of annotations with Ray to an otherwise large Python program, we were able to parallelize it. And previously in Python, parallelizing by using greenlets or queues or other things was kind of iffy. So we'll have a half-day tutorial about that side of what you can really do, the magic of the parallelism, and then we'll have the second half of the day we'll have about RLlib. We'll be doing some reinforcement learning, doing contextual bandits, and also be showing some of the AutoML features with Tune. And I believe we may cover some of RayServe too. And then we'll have an exam afterwards with a certification that goes along with it.
Paco, are you teaching a class?
Dean, I've been helping Dean to develop the tutorials, and then it looks like for Ray Summit, I'll be teaching both those classes. Also having a lot of fun. Dean and I've been going back and forth recently on the exams. So, there wasn't anything like a certification yet for Ray, so it's kind of a greenfield.
Right. And so, Ben, you are co-chairing the summit, and it is, of course, going to be virtual. What can attendees kind of expect with the experience?
Oh, so yeah, so it's going to be a virtual summit, and the other important thing, Jen, is it's free. So yeah, and we have a very strong lineup. So the nice thing, of course, as you do know, because it's a free conference, you can sign up even if you're only interested in 1 or 2 talks, right? Because it's free. So on the keynote side, we have actually quite a strong lineup on the keynote side. So we have the founders of AnyScale, which is the company behind Ray, opening things up. So this is Ion Stoica, Philip, and Robert. And then we will have 2 luminaries from the Python world, Wes McKinney, creator of Pandas, now more focused on Apache Arrow, and Gaël Verroquois, who is one of the founders of the Scikit-learn project. And then we have a Turing Award Prize winner, Dave Patterson, who will talk about specialized hardware for machine learning, now that he's at Google. Manuela Veloso, who headed up the machine learning department at Carnegie Mellon, but now heads up AI at JP Morgan Chase, will talk about how they're using Ray at JP Morgan Chase. And then we'll also have Zubin Garamani, who is a professor at Cambridge University, involved with a bunch of institutes, including the Alan Turing Institute. He will also be giving a talk. And then we're hoping to add, let's see, we're going to have at least a few more keynotes, one from a top machine learning lab, and then another keynote from one of the leading cloud providers. We'll talk about Ray in the context of serverless, because Ray also appeals to serverless crowd as far as its capabilities. And I'm also happy to announce that we have a speaker from DeepMind, Oriol Vinyals, who is best known for sequence-to-sequence learning back when he was still at Google. Then when he moved to DeepMind, he was the lead for the AlphaStar project, which created the first agent to beat the professionals at the game of StarCraft. But those are just the keynotes. So there's a lot of clusters of talks that I am happy to discuss. But like I said, the main thing here for the audience to understand is that the Ray community is now strong and vibrant. There will be several of your favorite speakers from the Python community talking about how they're using Ray themselves for their libraries, as well as speakers from leading companies. And since the conference is free, it's pretty low bar. You can go even if you only want to attend 1 or 2 talks.
And before we move on to talk more about this podcast and the history, where can folks register?
Oh, so the best place to go to is raysummit.org.
Excellent. Well, all right. So, as you mentioned at the top of this podcast episode, we are past 30 episodes. We're past the 6 month mark. So, it seems like a good time to pause and reflect. Ben, why don't we start with you? And why did you start the podcast, and what is your vision for it?
So when I was at O'Reilly, I did this podcast. I forget for how long, but we got to I should know this off the top of my head. Several hundred episodes, maybe. It was only every other week. Um, and then when I decided to leave O'Reilly, I kind of started thinking, well, I still want to keep talking to people, and I should just continue podcasting. And so that was kind of the genesis. And my goal has always been to get people to talk openly about interesting topics at the intersection of data, machine learning, and AI. Um, but I also like to focus on practitioners as much as possible. So people maybe slightly below the radar who are in the trenches, because I feel that they actually have a lot of the most interesting information. Um, and so that's why I actually started out. My first guest was Paco, right? So, because Paco was also a guest in my old podcast when I was at O'Reilly. So, yeah, so my goal was to keep kind of this conversation around these topics going. But in many ways now I have less constraints, right? Because I no longer work at a company. Now I can pretty much just set the program according to what's interesting and what's piquing my interest, rather than before. I have to confess, it was slightly aligned to conferences and promoting conferences, right? So when I was at O'Reilly, because I was chairing so many conferences back then. But yeah, so the goal is to highlight interesting work by people, some of which, or many of which, might not be as well known to the broad data, AI, and ML audience, but I feel that are deserving to be more broadly recognized. So one thing I was not anticipating, Jen, was that I would revert to a weekly podcast. I thought that, because I remember when we were at O'Reilly, you always warned me that the move from every other week to every week is insane, and I think you are probably right about that. But now I have enough of a rhythm that I think that I'm able to support a weekly episode with not much problem. I think going more frequent than weekly would be a problem.
Yes, I think so. So, Paco, you were the first guest, as Ben has mentioned, and though it's all been downhill since then, excluding your own episode, which has been your favorite? What are some highlights
Oh,
that
wow.
you note?
Thank you, Jenna. No, I started to make a list of what were my top few picks, and recently went back through all of them, and really tried hard to be very discerning. And after I got to like number 15 on my list of my very top picks, I realized that I was just going to give up, because there's no way I could really like narrow it down. It's hard to say. I'd like to point out some of them that really kind of hit me from left field, and they're just these amazing gems, of people who are in the trenches and making things happen that will have a lot of impact on the industry. And you haven't heard about it now, but you will be hearing about it later. So, I mean, I think that's one of the values that Ben has brought to the podcast, of just giving that forward perspective. Daphne Shah was probably one of my favorites in that regard. The title, we're talking about like computable empathy and jokes and things like that. And so I wasn't quite sure what to expect coming into it. But I had to re-listen to it a few times, because I just wanted to absorb as much as possible, and chase down the links and everything. I'm really enthralled by what Daphne was talking about there. So that's probably my top recommend.
And Ben, what moments stand out for you? Did you have any surprises?
Yeah, I think almost every episode, I go in thinking, okay, so I'm one of these podcasters. I hate to admit that when I record the podcast, I think, okay, I don't have to listen to that because I was there when I recorded, when the thing was recorded, right? But then I end up listening to it when it actually comes out, and then I pick up actually. When you're more relaxed, when you're not live, you can pick up a lot of information. So as Paco points out, that's true pretty much of every conversation I've had. I think that the main takeaway for me is that actually there's a lot of people working at the leading edge that are not necessarily doing leading edge research, but in many ways they're doing the harder work of implementing leading edge research. So a lot of my guests tend to fall under that category, and a lot of them are still struggling, Jen, honestly, with figuring out how to take some of these leading edge ideas and make it real in a real world production system. Um, so, for example, Paco, I don't know if you remember, I talked with Chris Nicholson
Yeah.
of PathMind. So they're taking RLib, which is the Ray library for reinforcement learning, and then trying to put that, use that to power these simulation software that a lot of companies are actually already using.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when I talked to him, it was pretty. They were pretty fairly early on in the process, so they're much further along now. But I could already tell that this was going to be a promising direction, and that a lot of people should learn about this, because I think one of the things, Jen, about reinforcement learning is a lot of the things that people see are these kind of demos of humanoids walking and things like that. Whereas what Chris was trying to do was take that technology and use it to power software that companies already use to solve problems in logistics, staffing, manufacturing, and things like that. So, yeah, I don't think a lot of people are aware that that's a great area to investigate if you're thinking about reinforcement learning.
Well, and that kind of brings me to my next question too. It's for both of you, and we'll start with Paco. So what kinds of things, or maybe something very specific, have you learned from any of these podcasts and any of these people that have maybe changed the way you approach your work, or added some direction that you hadn't gone down before, something like that?
The one from Chris Nicholson, I think, was also one that really changed a lot of my thinking. I did work in operations research. When my undergrad advisor was later chair of the department, and it's an old stodgy area of like simulations and optimization, and virtually any enterprise has a lot of this going on, whether you're talking about supply chain or factory automation, things like that. So there's a bunch of old, crufty software out there. And for that matter, reinforcement learning has been going on for decades. But when you add deep learning into reinforcement learning, and you add some of the new advances that we've seen, like that are embodied a lot in Ray and RLlib, and then you realize that reinforcement learning can like be put on to optimize virtually any simulation. And you think about how many enterprise simulation applications there are out there. It's a kind of a mind-boggling market greenfield, and I think that Chris Nicholson was really looking at that and understanding the business opportunity. Whereas so many of the tutorials are about playing some game or StarCraft or Atari or whatever, they're really looking at hard problems that people do all day, every day in business.
And Ben?
Yeah, so two broad themes. So the first one is ML risks. So this includes things like fairness and bias, privacy, security, ethics, safety, and reliability. So I've had several guests on these topics. So the most recent episode as we record this actually was not explicitly about this topic. It was about chatbots. This is Lauren
Oh yeah,
Kunze,
that's good.
CEO of Pandora Bots. But at some point, we started talking about, how do you deploy a chatbot? How do you know if it gets attacked? Will it turn into a Hitler Nazi bot, just like Microsoft A, right? So,
Yeah.
what are the safeguards? So yeah, so she started talking about some of the things that people do in order to protect against that. But she also said that I guess she reminded me. I'd forgotten about this, but a lot of these chatbots are actually trained using data from Reddit, which is not the most representative data set, right? Um, so she just described some of the things that can be done. They're a bit manual. It's a human in the loop interventions that you can do in order to make sure that your bot behaves safely. So I've had conversations with other people like this as well. For Krishna Gade of what's the name of the company?
Fiddler
Fiddler
Labs.
Labs. Yeah.
Yeah,
Who talked about model explainability.
yeah, that's good.
Morten Dahl talked about privacy preserving machine learning. So that's one broad theme. Oh, and actually, even Andrew Burt, who is the co-founder of the first law firm that specializes in AI and machine learning risk, right? So I was not aware that this would be a good opportunity for someone of his background, but he partnered with Patrick Hall, who's coming out of H2O. So they set up a law firm focused on helping companies mitigate risks and liabilities that stem from AI and machine learning. And then the more you talk to him, the more it makes sense, right? So if you're the chief legal counsel of a company, you tend to have go-to lawyers for different topics, right? So if something happens around privacy, you may have a law firm that you call, that you consult. So same thing apparently is happening in machine learning and AI. So these chief legal counsels know that just like you'll probably have to have everyone has a privacy policy, even my podcast. Uh, at some point, companies will have to have a policy about how they actually deploy machine learning and AI. So, and then they'll have to consult with external firms that specialize in these things. So, yeah. So the whole topic of ML risk, I think, has been a great subject for this podcast. And then the other, which is less direct, is I happen to talk to several people who are leading open source projects in data and machine learning. Uh, and so I always ask them, so how do you make sure that your project is growing? What metrics are you checking? And they also come from a variety of backgrounds, Jen. Some of them are full-time just on the open source. They have some kind of foundation. And then some have to worry about, okay, the open source is great, but how do we pay the bills, right? So,
Mhm.
so that has always been an interesting topic for me. But on the other hand, there's also kind of the newsy topics like COVID. I've had a
Yeah.
couple of guests, Bruno
Oh no.
Gonçalves, who specialized in these epidemic models before he moved on to data science and finance. And then Amy Heineke with
Yeah.
Primer, a company that Paco is involved with, and their website, COVID Primer. Yeah, so I try to mix it up, and then there's another highlight for me probably will be Pete Warden and TinyML,
Yeah.
a topic that I knew about and kind of read a little bit about, but then talking to Pete, I probably got a crash course and learned a lot about what was happening in that field and the potential applications, the state of where they're in, and then just the unique challenges of what they're doing. And of course, the episode dedicated to machine learning and finance, anchored
Mhm.
by the fabulous Jenn Webb, with Arun, who actually is, I think, one of these people that a lot more people need to know more about him, because he's been at that intersection of data science and finance for years and years, and he's seen the industry change. He's seen fashions come and go, and he actually provided a lot of realism to what people actually do, as opposed to all the hype that you read sometimes in the press about the use of AI in finance.
You mentioned that you often ask your guests what metrics they use to measure success. What are some of the most common responses you got from that? That's interesting.
I think the most common response is, of course, the default is GitHub stars, right? So GitHub stars and downloads. So then I think most of them start out that way. And then they realize that, okay, so this is kind of a good vanity metric, which you should pay attention to, GitHub stars, because unfortunately, Paco, VCs pay attention to GitHub stars. So you should probably pay attention to it. But then at the end of the day, they start moving on to other things like things that proxy engagement with developers, right? So like how many people are actually using your library, and then the more sophisticated teams really instrument their documentation, so they know exactly what people are having trouble with or what they're reading about, and things like this. But I think out of the gate, downloads and GitHub stars. But yeah, Paco, the download thing in the Python community is a bit of a confusing thing, because I think you got the pip install, and then
Sure.
People, almost everyone you talk to will have some period where they have some unexplained burst spike that they can't explain.
Well,
It might have been there might have been a conference or something, but sometimes they don't have explanation for why suddenly there was a spike, right? So
there was something that came to the surface from a few of the people. They mentioned that what they liked was not so much the GitHub stars, but over the past year, GitHub had been putting more and more emphasis on understanding where your repo is getting used by another repo. So where are the use cases? And the latest redesign for GitHub kind of buried that, but you can still find it. And I think it's probably a lot better information about, like, not only how broad of usage do you have, but what are the use cases?
yeah. No. Like I said, the GitHub stars is a useful metric because the VCs follow it.
Yeah. I mean, there was an interesting hardware thread. I think I really liked Nir, and of course Pete. And Nir has some things that really, again, strike me out of left field, because there's a lot of implications about how to use hardware more intelligently, how to get a lot more bang for the buck out of what most people would have doing sophisticated work with machine learning. That you don't need to pour all of your capital expenditure into buying hardware. So I thought that was good. And Pete invited me to lunch like 6 years ago. I remember him starting to talk about some of these ideas, and it's been fun to check in with him periodically and see it develop. But what they're doing right now with TinyML is really mind blowing to me. I mean, anybody can go out and buy a Raspberry Pi for like $40, or well, maybe a little bit more depending on what you want to get. But what TinyML has been doing to put multiple deep learning models onto chips that don't even have batteries. I mean, they're just working, they're powered off of ambient light, and they're running on bare metal. It's really amazing what they've accomplished, and just also how broad the applications are.
And speaking of deep learning, actually, a couple of people that Paco and I know well, Evan Sparks and Amit Talwalkar, have been on the podcast. And
This was good.
Amit is interesting because he's also a faculty member at Carnegie Mellon. But he's long emphasized kind of his common theme is democratizing machine learning. So he's trying to take the research he's doing at Carnegie Mellon and making it accessible to regular developers, not even data scientists, right? So most recently, he's been doing a lot of work in this area called neural architecture search, which even he admits is a bit too early for even their tools at their startup, Derwen.ai. But he thinks that it's slowly becoming something that you can put into product, which they have with Determined. But again, it's a way for people to explore different types of deep learning architectures without necessarily having all of the expertise in-house. So it turns out, Jen, when you're doing deep learning, you can either take a deep learning architecture off the shelf and try to use that in your for your problem, maybe tune it a little bit for your data. But sometimes maybe that's not enough. Maybe you need a completely new architecture for your use case. And so what do you do if you don't have the in-house expertise? So some of these tools that Amit and Evan are building are designed to maybe narrow the gap between research and regular developers.
Interesting. So, Paco, who would you like to see on the podcast that hasn't been on yet?
That hasn't been on yet. Interesting. Okay, so
but there's a caveat though, which which is basically hasn't been there yet, but you have to help us get this.
Okay. Gladly, I'll help. So a lot of work lately that I've been doing is in the area of knowledge graphs, and that's gone through. I wanted to take exception with a friend. I really like the talk from Denise Gozel about graph databases, but there is kind of a split in the world. There's sort of the people who do graph queries and graph databases, and the people who do graph algorithms and knowledge graphs. And I think that the former doesn't recognize the latter, but it's almost like if you were to go back a decade, there was this big split between business intelligence teams and data science, where the former didn't recognize the latter, and then it all shifted. So I would say that some of the large industry applications of knowledge graph that have been coming up are really interesting.
So Paco, for our audience, what is a knowledge graph?
Sure, yeah. Well, you may have heard the term ontology, the idea of having some kind of, let's say, or in less 2-bit words, some kind of taxonomy of concepts or concept map, you might say. There's a mammal, and then under mammal, there's a feline, and under feline, there's a cat, and under a cat, there's a kitten. You can have those kind of taxonomies, and any thesaurus is going to be basically that. Library of Congress, lots of it are basically that. But then there's the idea of how do you populate it with something that's interesting, and then how do you use that? So I might have a taxonomy of all the widgets that are used on my factory floor and who all my different customers are and the verticals that their use cases are in, and characterize what kind of flaws that we see coming back from quality control. I might have a taxonomy of that. I probably do if I'm a company like, I don't know, Bosch or BMW or one of those. But the important part is that I have a number of different factories, and I can take their data and then organize it based on relationships. And the thing that's interesting with knowledge graphs is that if you try to put those kind of relationships into a relational database, you have this problem of what's called a self-join, where typically a relational database will just go to its knees because you can't leverage the indexes the way that they were designed. But if you have a graph, you can start to do some really interesting magic, like with deep learning, doing graph embedding and being able to look at partial patterns and sort of fill in the blanks of what you think should probably be there but hasn't been populated yet. And there's a lot of great use cases for that, missing metadata or understanding how to fix factory process better, on and on. And I definitely, I would argue for a couple of people, Daniel Vilsois, we made an introduction, Francois Scharf, actually, I think you introduced Francois to me, and some of the other folks that are working in knowledge graph, because it really is an interesting way of both representation, but then also leveraging deep learning to do some pretty interesting predictive power.
And so, Ben, who is your dream guest?
I don't necessarily have a dream guest, Jen, because I'm basically just kind of treading water, trying to get a guest every week. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, so I think I'm going to try to do a concerted push around NLP and computer vision, because I think those are the two areas where there are a lot of interesting things happening. I have to say that computer vision, I'm a little wary myself, because there's also kind of a lot of it's a slippery slope around ethics and surveillance and fairness and bias. That's why I haven't actually done much in that area yet. So for sure, I think NLP, because I'm also involved with another conference called the NLP Summit, which Paco is going to give a keynote in. And then actually maybe Paco, maybe it's time to do a kind of a concerted push around RL as well, huh? Are we starting to see, is RL going beyond the cart pole and
some more use cases that could be good. I mean, I think another theme that you brought out that might be good to focus on periodically was, I really loved Wes McKinney's talk and just sort of his breadth
the kind of the big data. Sometimes sometimes, Jen, I have to kind of concertedly go back to my roots around the data engineering and big data, because so much of what we talk about these days is ML.
Well, I mean, the other thing, I mean, Wes is really talking a lot about open source and sort of open source governance of projects, and how do you really make that work in the long run to have communities of developers contributing and different companies involved? I thought that kind of perspective is just it's invaluable, and it's something that it could be its own topic area. There should be books about it.
Yeah, I'd like to actually, speaking of which, Jen, I'd like to get someone to talk about the elections in November. I'm just trying
That's a good idea.
I'm trying to figure out what the right timing is.
You could have Joel. I suggest having Joel on.
Oh yeah, he's on. He's coming on in August 13. Yeah, we stayed away from that topic. But I could get Sam Wang, I suppose.
I was going to suggest Sam. Yeah, he had a good time last election.
Yeah. It's a bit of a tricky thing. Who do you get to talk about the election that has enough chops? I guess Sam Wang would be one, right? So
well, and he's got an interesting perspective too, looking at the neurology of politics.
Yeah. I haven't been following. I went to his site. It's obviously very much bullish on the Democratic Party's chances, but that was the case the last time around.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe we can talk to a friend of ours, Jonathan Goldman, has been working some.
Right. Oh yeah. So Jen, the other thing that I probably would want to also start getting some guests on is disinformation, fake media, deep fakes, disinformation. That would be a good topic. Because there's a lot happening there, and I have some ideas of who to put on there. And also just like I said, the broader theme of if we're going to use more and more ML, how do we do it safely? Right. So.
All right. Well, that seems like a good spot to close our episode. Thank you guys so much. That was really fun.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.